American wise. This attack happened.
And now we have to live with this complexity. Of course, the world is becoming more complex all the time. And our reality, our perceived reality, is increasingly being influenced by forces that are largely undetectable to us. That seems to be one of the primary effects of the internet, the Tower of Babel in the metaphoric slideshow there, and its effect on our societies. I want to say it's really lovely to be here in this story theater tonight with you. I always feel that theater is a kind of sacred place where people come together in community in real time, in analog space at the same time, to consider important questions. And that's a kind of a humanistic experience that I don't think that the digital technology offers us. So I'm very grateful that we can be together tonight. And I think it's very brave of Theater Neumarkt to try to bridge the analog and the digital in this event, because that's a very difficult thing to do artistically. But that bridge, that relationship between analog and digital, is an interface that raises some of the most important and complexing questions that we face today. So tonight, I'm going to talk to you about why hacking matters. And for that, you're going to need to absorb a series of ideas, hacker ideas, that will help you to see the world the way that hackers do. And I have to admit, some of these ideas are rather dense. As the hackers in the audience might know, they're a little dense to unpack, especially in a short period of time. But I know you're up for the task, and I invite you to listen carefully. I think the best place to start is with the hacker thesis that Larry Lessig of Harvard Law expounded on famously. And that idea is code is law. Code is law. That means that in a world of ubiquitous computing, the self-executing nature of code will largely determine our relationships and rights, and even undermine constitutional guarantees if we do not pay attention to it. In other words, it means that the power of code is really more strong than that of law to create norms in society. Code, more than law, is going to determine the kinds of societies we live in and whether they end up resembling democracies at all. And if you doubt this, I ask you to consider the really complete ineffectiveness of our existing legal privacy regimes to protect us against corporate surveillance, capitalist surveillance, and the failure of constitutional guarantees in the face of censorship by algorithms. So, as Julia said, I'm a labor and constitutional lawyer, and I have to say, as a lawyer, it did take me a while to cotton on to the idea that code is law. But when I did, finally, the question arose for me: if code is largely setting the norms by which we are now living, who controls code? This seemed to me to be an urgent civics question. There's a struggle taking place right now to build the coded world around us, and ordinary computer users and citizens are at the mercy of the code makers. In this environment, hackers, I discovered, are like shamans because only they can interpolate between the code and us. Now, you might be familiar with the stereotype of hackers as dangerous, nihilistic elements in society, or the malign agents of foreign powers. And the first speakers tonight touched on that kind of hacking to some extent. These are real threats, not to be minimized, but this is not the whole hacker story. In the last couple of decades, there's been really a burgeoning of the progressive hacker movement, coalescing around groups like the Chaos Computer Club in Germany. And I think this movement has shown that hackers can be vital disruptors in the emerging digital environment with its dystopic and anti-democratic tendencies. You may have heard of the famous hacker ethos, and a core tenet of that, as the hackers in the audience would know, is the hands-on imperative. The hands-on imperative. This is the idea that access to computers and to anything else that might teach you how the world works should be unlimited and total. Hackers believe that one should be able to take digital systems and really any systems apart and interrogate them, study them, improve upon them, and share one's improvements with others. The hacker ethos and its hands-on digital imperative has had a profound effect on digital technology since the early days. The influence is huge. Hackers, of course, were some of the original innovators in Silicon Valley. They've made an immense contribution to the digital environment with the development of free software, that is, code that can be studied, questioned, built upon, repurposed, and shared. And as some of you may know, free and open software, the new Linux software, really has become the backbone of the digital world. It runs on most of the internet servers, on most of the world's supercomputers, on the New York Stock Exchange, on the platforms of Google, Amazon, and Facebook, and many government platforms as well. Hackers were key players in the democratic movements of the Arab Spring and Occupy, and since at least the early 2000s, citizens and hackers have been working together to help guarantee citizens' privacy, to bring transparency and accountability to those in power, to realize the social and economic goals of Occupy in the digital era, and to upgrade democratic processes themselves. And of course, two of the most momentous stories in the short history of hacking are those of Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. Assange and WikiLeaks, which published leaked information about states and oligarchs that ushered in an age of unprecedented transparency into global politics. And and Edward Snowden, who revealed the extent of the USA's intelligence services violation of privacy around the world. And in the last decade or two as well, and many people aren't aware of this, I cover it in the last part of my book, there's been a fascinating mainstreaming and institutionalization of hacking and hacking experiments in places like Harvard, MIT, and Stanford that underscores the rising significance of the hacking phenomenon. This mainstreaming has really garnered new respectability and resources for hacking, although it has had its positive and its negative effects. So hackers, I would argue, see the digital systems that are increasingly shaping our world and our lived reality more clearly and more critically than anyone else. And the ideas that hackers have been developing over the past 3 decades on how to build out those systems so as to preserve democracy, or rather the emancipatory and the democratic potential of digital technology, the ideas of free software and commons-based production, of privacy and transparency adapted to the digital age, of net neutrality, and of data self-determination and trust busting adapted to the digital age. These principles, along with the tools that hackers have been developing to secure them, could be as important to a new digital age of democracy as the great organizing principles of liberty, fraternity, and equality were to the Enlightenment era of democracy. The progressive hacker scene, or movement, if you prefer, that I write about in this book, which, by the way, the book was published by MIT Press, so it shows you how consequential, really, the whole phenomenon of hacking is and has become in the last decade. The progressive hacker movement is really all about distributed democracy. That is distributed decision-making, distributed power, distributed governance. And progressive hackers have been hard at work using the power of code to build decentralized distributed systems. Hackers see the dangers inherent in centralized systems, systems of centralized control, whether that control is held on the left or the right. And interestingly, most hackers don't believe that those political categories really pertain much anymore to current circumstances. And that's something that I've actually gradually come to agree with. And I say that as someone who comes from the very traditional left, being a trade unionist and a labor lawyer. Edward Snowden said once that the United States had created a surveillance infrastructure that would make turnkey tyranny possible. And I think this situation is now upon us. And I promised Julia that I would inject some political drama into the talk tonight. So I'm going to do that. Woo, political drama. And, you know, you can fight with me about it after, because you may disagree with me, and that's fine. But I'm going to say it, and I'm going to say that it's the traditional left, the so-called progressive governance that hold powers in most Western democracies now, who have turned the key of tyranny and have been wielding the authoritarian power offered by digital systems for the last couple of years. Censorship imposed by digital platforms in collusion with governments or at the behest of governments, mandated medical procedures, the division of society into compliant and non-compliant citizens, the persecution and marginalization of the non-compliant through Chinese-style social credit systems, the introduction of digital ID that has the aim of setting up a single platform or access point to all government services and potentially all public and private transactions in society through the use of a government authenticated QR code on one's cell phone. And as happened in my country, Canada, the government's recent cutting off of bank accounts of political opponents without court supervision or due process. These are all a betrayal, I believe, of the tenets of Western liberal democracy and the political rights one finds in international human rights documents like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which in fact a Canadian drafted, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And I have to emphasize this. This is because centralized digital systems offer immense temptations for governments to control their populations, for social control. Temptations that few politicians, it seems, will resist. And in counterpoint to centralized systems of control, hackers say, we must develop systems that are controlled by no one. We must develop systems that are controlled by everyone and no one at the same time. In my book, Coding Democracy, I have a whole chapter on the risks and value of transgressive acts, and unfortunately we don't have time to cover all of that content tonight. But just suffice to say, it's a kind of reverie on how many social movements in history that have been successful have in fact been engaged in the transgression of existing norms, whether it was through general strikes or boycotts, through sabotage, civil disobedience, the destruction of property, or even more serious forms of so-called criminality. And I posit the argument that how law treats various hacker acts will be part of the dialectic that determines where we end up as societies with our democratic ideals, where we end up at the end of the 21st century. I don't think it's, by any means clear where the line is between good and bad hacking. And I explore that at some length in that chapter. It's not clear where the lines should necessarily be drawn or how to regulate hacking wisely in every instance. And every type of hacking, every situation really needs to be parsed quite carefully. But I think that citizens need to start thinking about this line drawing seriously, since we will be grappling with it for the better part of this coming century. Now, in researching this book, I had the privilege of traveling to many places. I visited a theater collective in Spain that was also a hacker collective that brought down some of the most important bankers and politicians in Spain through a leaking platform designed by Global Leaks, the hacking group Global Leaks. I interviewed MPs from the Cinque Stelle movement in Italy. I talked to lawyers at the Electronic Frontier Foundation in San Francisco. I traveled to the islands of the Salish Sea to talk to computer engineers and prepare my own security for the Chaos Communications Camp, which I went and struck a tent up and talked to hackers at that very important event that happens only every 4 years. And those are just some of the groups of hackers that I talked to. But I also went to Harvard and MIT towards the end of my investigation. And I talked to a number of people that are big names in IT and systems theory and legal theory around these issues. And I met a Spanish computer engineer who said something very interesting to me. He said, Hacking is between reform and revolution. Hacking, he said, makes reformers happy because it brings reform, but it does not break the system. It makes revolutionaries happy because it's not conforming to the values of the system, and it is triggering emergent effects that might ultimately break down the system. In other words, one is hacking a reform with the hope of changing the whole system. And this is the last idea that I want to leave you with tonight, the idea of emergence, emergent effects. It's something that people who study systems theory talk about in particular. And emergence is the idea that a small change in the micro can actually trigger very large changes in the macro structure. So you have a property that is not in the macro, but emerges over time from interactions at the micro level. And one example is the beautiful patterns that flocks of starlings make when they fly in the night sky. And this is the idea behind the image that you're seeing here. These birds don't plan or intend the shapes that they make. They might only have, a few unconscious rules that they're following at the micro level, like don't get too close, don't cross paths, don't fly into each other, or fly forward. And the flock pattern will emerge, not as a pre-planned, predestined, or externally imposed thing, but really something that is completely bottoms up. And a very famous or well-known legal scholar at Harvard said to me, this really, in many ways, is what free software is a great example of emergent effects. It was a bottoms-up phenomenon, and a sort of a fringe innovation by a hacker, Richard Stallman, that took off and became the unlikely dominant competitor and backbone of the coded world, as I described earlier. So if you look at the history of technology, which shapes our societies in so many visible and invisible ways, you realize that tech develops in a haphazard, nonlinear way. We really can't be sure where tech is going next. But if there's some chance that change could come through some triggering of emergent effects, then it's more important than ever that we are experimenting. And that is what hackers are doing, experimenting as much as possible. And in this environment, one might think of hackers as agents of positive chaos, which is a term that Wal Holland, one of the founders of the Chaos Computer Club, liked to use. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking and or debating with you over the course of the weekend.
Thank you very much, Maureen.